Well, thanks for asking me to open today's very important meeting and for the opportunity to put the discussions into context and of mapping the shadow that the global COVID-19 pandemic's cast on media freedom. Because even beyond the realm of public health, the effects of the pandemic have been felt in almost every aspect of people's lives. The global economy faces the worst recession since the Depression of the 1930s. The International Labour Organization estimate that the equivalent of 195 million full-time jobs will be lost. Governments around the world have been thrown into crisis, and restrictions on movement and association are on an unprecedented scale around the world. But the coronavirus has also posed a huge threat to media freedom worldwide. The virus has reshaped the way that journalists and media work. They face increased pressure and exposures on the front line, more limited access, more shutdowns, more stifling laws, restrictions on movement, and accompany that with a huge loss of jobs and pay and social conditions for journalists themselves. And at a time when, above all, citizens need unfettered access to independent, balanced public interest journalism, it has never faced such a global attack as governments and authorities seek to silence the messenger, and hence the name of this presentation. But when we talk about context, and for journalism, context is key, we mustn't be fooled into thinking that the attack on media freedom is the result of the COVID-19 crisis. It isn't. COVID-19 has undoubtedly provided authoritarian governments with a smokescreen with which to impose more widespread restrictions on media freedoms. But the killing, jailing, harassment of journalists didn't begin with COVID-19. Indeed, over the past decade, almost 2 journalists killed every week, killed in war, in civil and ethnic conflict, as a result of reporting on crime, on drugs, by paramilitaries, by corporations who don't like environmental journalists. More than 1,100 journalists killed in the last 12 years. And not just in war zones. Most of those journalists who were killed were silenced for covering stories about corruption, crime, and politics in their own country. According to UNESCO, 93% of the victims were local journalists. And so when you're a journalist, picking up your child from school can be a more dangerous part of the job than reporting from a war zone. Throughout that same period, 90% of the crimes against journalists have remained unsolved. In some countries, impunity runs at 100%. And that culture of impunity works to embolden would-be perpetrators of violence, whether governments or other bodies and individuals, while also working to silence journalists by encouraging self-censorship and deterring the investigation of sensitive topics. But of course, the killing of journalists is just the tip of the iceberg. On a daily basis, the International Federation of Journalists records incidences of violence and threats, of internet shutdowns, of arrests, detentions, of jailings, of censorship, and of legal action being taken against journalists and media. Take the jailing of journalists in 2019, the number of journalists imprisoned for their reporting globally reached at least 250 for the 4th consecutive year, and China and Turkey, that we'll come on to talk about, are the world's leading jailers. On top of that, the arrest and detention of journalists has a chilling effect. And this chart done by CPJ shows the leading jailers of journalists around the world. But of course, it's not just jailings. Internet shutdowns in 2019 went up by 235% increase in just the last 3 years. In 2019, more than 18,000 hours of shutdowns and 122 national or regional total shutdowns. Among the countries most prominent in attacking freedom of information, Egypt, 34,000 websites were suffering intermittent, partial or complete blocks in 2019. In India, there were 72 targeted internet shutdowns across the country. But of course, when we come to talk about Turkey later on, it's not just the internet that is shut down. At least 170 media outlets closed down since 2016 over accusations of spreading terrorist propaganda. And of course, there are those internet shutdowns which have almost entirely stopped communication within certain societies. In Kashmir, the longest internet shutdown on record, 213 days, and even after 213 days, it was only partially, communication was only partially restored. And of course, governments and other authorities tie journalists up in legal knots too, using criminal defamation laws, laws which prevent you from damaging the honor of politicians or religious leaders. And of course, the war on terror and accompanying new national security laws have helped restrict the space in which journalists can operate. And all of this is happening in an environment in which politicians and leading figures increasingly stigmatize journalists by openly criticizing them. In an ever-growing number of countries, journalists face physical and verbal attacks, including from presidents, prime ministers, and powerful individuals. And it's no accident that the picture that I'm using there is from a Trump rally, because where Trump leads, many other politicians now follow. And of course, journalists rely hugely on sources and whistleblowers in order to be able to bring information to the public. Public interest journalism relies on these people, and the increasing surveillance that there is around the world poses a danger for journalists and their sources. And more surveillance laws are being passed in states ostensibly to fight terrorism or to fight crime, but which actually end up preventing journalists from operating independently. And of course, there are a whole raft of other laws and measures that are used by governments seeking to clamp down on media freedom, from financial sanctions, the use of investigations in tax, the use of advertising to reward their friends and punish dissident media, from ownership rules that prevent certain people or certain groups or foreign companies from owning media, and of course regulation, who decides who can broadcast on the airwaves. And on top of all this, increasing poverty and more precarious work for journalists helps to breed corruption and thereby fuel disinformation and bias. And journalists increasingly become reliant on the goodwill and the money of politicians or corporations or governments or even warlords or paramilitary groups. And in this kind of economic environment, fake news and sensationalism thrive, local democracy suffers, and those time-consuming investigative reports, which get less traffic but cost more money to produce, become increasingly rare. As one journalist said when I was writing an article about this, why seek the truth when it's more profitable to deliver clicks? So if that was the context when the pandemic hit, what's been the impact of COVID-19 on media freedom? Undoubtedly, it has served to worsen the media freedom environment. It has helped provide a smokescreen for authoritarian governments to clamp down further, both on media and more generally on freedom of expression. They have used people's genuine fear about a global health pandemic to be able to bring in laws that they say are temporary measures that they wouldn't have been able to bring in at other times. But we know all too often temporary measures become permanent. We've witnessed, and I think all the press freedom organizations have documented an increased number of media freedom violations. So things like the arrest and jailing of journalists, often used to cover up corruption, to cover up failings of government, usually on very vague allegations, often a pretext to jail or arrest the journalist who had been targeted before. And when those journalists, when they're held in pre-trial detention or whether they're jailed, this is putting their lives increasingly at risk, because prisons are, of course, a place where the coronavirus spreads more rapidly. And we've seen an increase in the number of physical and verbal attacks, on online attacks, on doxing, but also on the stigmatization. And that stigmatization is not only a wrong thing, but it is dangerous because it then opens those journalists up to more physical and verbal attacks by others. Take the case of Egyptian journalist Mohammed Munir, who died after contracting COVID-19 while in pre-trial detention. He was arrested by Egyptian security forces on June the 15th after writing an article criticising the country's management of the pandemic, and died after having been released from prison but having contracted COVID-19 whilst in prison. Or take the case of Pakistani journalist Abdul Mateen Achakzai and his colleague, a reporter for Sama News TV, who were tortured for 3 days by anti-terrorism forces for their coverage of the inhumane conditions in a COVID-19 centre near the Afghan border. We have also seen an increase in the use of legal actions against journalists, of fake news legislation, of denials of access to information. So journalists being denied access to press conferences, having their visas revoked, being deported, press cards not being recognised, only certain categories of journalists being allowed into press conferences. We had a situation in Zimbabwe where only official state media were allowed to cover certain events and private media weren't. So those fake news legislation, and I'm sure we'll hear a little bit about the legislation in Turkey and Russia and newer legislation later on. But take the Philippines as an example, the Human Security Act that's been passed there that extends the number of days that a journalist can be arrested without a warrant, allows the police and military to conduct 60-day surveillance activity on suspected terrorists. And of course, many of those suspected terrorists just happen also to be independent journalists. And it also works to remove some of the defenses and remedies that there are for people when they've been accused of terrorism. There is a list of countries that in the space of 3 months following the COVID-19 pandemic had passed new laws around fake news or around national security, the need to report the truth and so on. It's not by any means exhaustive. We've also seen increasing restrictions on freedom of movement, more and more shutdowns, and the economic pressures that journalists have faced. Thousands have lost their jobs, hundreds and hundreds of titles across the world have been shut down. The International Association of Broadcasters estimates that 98% of their members have lost up to 80% of their advertising revenue. And in these kind of situations, it is independent media in many parts of the world who are suffering the most and therefore unable to continue to provide the kind of coverage. I was going to talk a little bit about some of the statistics from Turkey, from China, from Russia, but I think maybe given that we have so many speakers and a panel on all of those, I'll just mention a couple of things. Obviously in Turkey, the new social media law comes on top of what has been more than almost 4 years now of a serious crackdown on the media, with 170 media forcibly closed and a number of websites, radio signals blocked and shut down. And we've seen increasing numbers of arrests, not just that initial phase when lots of people who were deemed to be supporters of the coup were arrested, but now for the type of coverage of the regime in Turkey. So around espionage, around refugees, around issues to do with COVID-19, with corruption, the big scandal around the death of an intelligence agent as well. In China, we obviously have seen more than, well, almost 50 jailings of journalists in 2019 and possibly more. Over 100 journalists currently in jail, many of them as a result of closed trials. But one recent case, 15 years a journalist given in prison for exposing corruption. And then you have things like the Terminus 2049 project, where people are arrested and people are charged on a crowdsourced project for simply for collecting and sharing information. COVID-19 has increased or has worsened the situation in China. There's been a whole raft of takedown notices requiring media to take down articles. There's been forced quarantine of journalists being reported as having disappeared and then appearing 2 or 3 weeks later, having been saying they have been forced into quarantine. Increase in the number of arrests as well. If you take Russia, I mean, censorship, 490,000 websites have been impacted by Russia's online censorship. Fake news laws increasingly used, and increased fines, more takedown notices, more correction orders, more criminal investigations of individual journalists. You take arrests. You take Ivan Sovronov, for example, on suspicion of state terror. The day before his arrest, a reporter was fined $7,000 for supporting terrorism. And yet all they had done was what we would consider journalism. They've used ownership laws to increase control, so outlawing levels of foreign ownership. Therefore, US and Finnish backers, for example, have sold media that have been bought up by pro-Kremlin owners. So when there is a global health pandemic, surely some people say, well, it's quite right that journalists can't just say anything. Isn't it irresponsible just to allow journalists to operate in the way they had done before? So why is it important that we have events like this, that we campaign and advocate for media freedoms? Well, journalism doesn't change the world. Lots of people go into journalism thinking they're going to change the world. But when media acts in the public interest, it can help undercut lies, distortions, hate, censorship, secrecy, all those tools that are used by anti-democratic governments or corporations or extremist movements and other vested interests in order to hold on to power. And it is that information that can act as a spur to people to stand up for their democratic rights and for different values in their societies. And at this time, media freedom like that everywhere affects our health everywhere. So it is absolutely vital that people have access to the information that they need about infection rates, about contagion, about government policies, about access to support, about health services, and so on. And as a British MP said when it was being discussed, democracy and, as we're learning, public health depend on open, honest reporting. Without the ability to question and report, society is left blind to the abuses of its leaders or the threats that confront it. Now, there will be lots of people today with lots of ideas about what we should do, but let me just finish on this. Among some of the measures, and only some of the measures, immediate that are necessary. Fair and equal access for all media, not allowing them to decide which media can report, which media have access to information, which media are allowed to operate. Freedom of movement for journalists, including for freelancers. Increasingly, people rely on local freelancers to be able to cover a story, particularly when there is less freedom of movement across borders. And no use of the visa and accreditation processes to prevent legitimate scrutiny, and a proportionate use of laws, not using emergency powers to restrict media freedom or punish critical media. Urgent for the release of jailed journalists, not just because journalists shouldn't be jailed for doing their job, but because of the increased health risks that those journalists and other prisoners and human rights defenders face at the moment. That journalists should have the right to health and the right to personal protective equipment. Too many journalists are being sent to cover stories without their employers or their society making available to them the equipment that they need to protect their health. And we urgently need measures to sustain independent journalism, whether that is taxing the technology platforms that make a fortune from journalism but pay nothing towards producing that journalism, whether it is public subsidies to help journalism, whether it is through global development funds that help sustain some independent media. It is urgent that there are measures on a global level to help sustain independent journalism. And the IFJ has been making this a priority issue with our global platform for quality journalism that we've been campaigning on in recent months. So thank you very much. I just want to leave you once again with that quote, which I think sets the tone for the discussions we're going to have today. And I'll be really interested to hear more in depth from those people who are the specialists on China, on Turkey and on Russia, the impact of COVID-19 on the already dire press freedom situation in those countries, and what they think we as a coalition of press freedom, human rights defenders can do in order to be able to try to roll back this increasing authoritarianism. Thank you.